Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this month's Evenings at Ease program. I'm very, very pleased to have Susan Eisenhower with us tonight. She's going to talk to us about her new book, How Ike Led, the principles behind Eisenhower's biggest decisions. This is something I've been looking forward to for a long time, and I'm very, very grateful to Susan's flexibility to be able to do this online rather than in person. So Susan, as we all know, has had a career as a DC-based political analyst. She's the CEO and chairman of the Eisenhower Group and the Chairman Emeritus at the Eisenhower Institute of Gettysburg College. She is also the Chairman Emeritus with the Trustees of the Eisenhower Foundation. And more importantly, I call her a friend of mine. So thank you, Susan, for being here with us tonight.
Oh, Don, thank you very much for that heartfelt introduction. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And let me just say, Don, I love your informality because that's exactly the way I hope this evening will run. There are so many people here in this audience tonight who have something to contribute to stories about Dwight Eisenhower and his legacy. So let me just say that I'm going to keep my remarks a bit shorter than is typical for these sorts of book lectures. And I know how often you hear about Dwight Eisenhower through authors who have written about him. So I think I can add some things, but I would love to hear from you as well. Thank you also for engaging in this adventure with me. It's called The Adventure of Online Presentations. You know, there's a little bit of heaviness in my heart because I was so looking forward to a homecoming this October. I was scheduled to speak at the Eisenhower Foundation dinner and also to do this particular presentation in person. And so, you know, there is a kind of sadness to it, but, you know, the upside is we can include people from all over the country and the world. And in that respect, I just want to single out two people I'm so thrilled are here. First of all, David Nichols. Thank you so much, David, for being with us this evening. I want everybody to know that if not for How Ike Led, I mean, it really, I got more encouragement than I deserved from David Nichols in writing this book, not only because of the three landmark books he wrote on Dwight Eisenhower's policies, both in civil rights during the Suez or the 1956 set of crises, and also Joe McCarthy, but also for his friendship. And then also I'd like to give a very big shout out to Klaus Grundl, who is here with us this evening. Klaus, you know, thank you so much for coming. Klaus's family story plays a big part in my chapter on Eisenhower called Beyond Ethnic, well, see, I can't remember the title of the chapter, but it's really about Eisenhower's roots in Kansas and how those were informed by his ancestors' connection to Germany. And this leads, of course, to his wartime responsibilities. And it's so wonderful that Klaus is with us this evening because his family played, I think, a very important role in providing a bridge to the United States and Germany after the war, but also imagine that Klaus is also a resident of Abilene, Kansas. So thank you for being with us from Bavaria at 2 o'clock in the morning. Dawn, I don't think that we could even continue this conversation without a shout out to you as director of the Eisenhower Library and all that goes with that, including an extraordinary museum, etc. And I want to thank you for this opportunity and also for your friendship. Tim Reeves played an important role in this book. What an extraordinary archivist he is. And whenever I had a question, he was so timely about answering it that I really am very moved by the fact that I think the Eisenhower Library is head and shoulders right up there with all the other libraries. And we've been very, very proud of the archival commitment to opening up all of this, all of the things that are contained in the library as soon as possible. And Mary, Bertzloff, who was extraordinary in helping with the photos. Everyone played such an important part of this book. Now let's talk about Abilene a little bit, because now we're onto the subject itself. And I just have to say, before I, offer some observations about Abilene's role in Eisenhower's life, what fun it is that my sister Mary is now part of your community. And I have envious feelings about it, because there's nothing like the community that comes from a place small enough so that people can know each other and care about each other in a very direct way. Mary's having a wonderful time, and I know how much that is dependent on all of you who are her friend, and standing side by side with her as she pursues her important work in international relations. So anyway, Abilene, I got so much fun out of adding the important Abilene moments in Ike's life in this book. And of course, the family folklore and actually the public folklore at this point about Ike's upbringing is a little bit like a Huck Finn kind of story. We all know that he was off in the woods with any number of his friends, fishing and doing all kinds of things that young kids do. He was, I think, a pretty good student. As a matter of fact, the Abilene high school yearbook declared that someday he would be a renowned history professor at Yale University. It was his older brother, Edgar, who was predicted to be a two-term president. And actually, between you and me, I'm not sure that they ever got this quite straight. As you'll read in the book, Edgar Eisenhower was giving the President of the United States advice on a regular basis, as you know, older brothers would do. In any case, Ike and his family, at least in our family, never stopped being a guiding light for all of us. Ida Stover Eisenhower, who you all know well from Abilene lore, was one of these extraordinarily calm and centered women. I think Eisenhower once said that she took her community responsibilities so seriously that she, was committed in every way to the betterment and the health of all of her neighbors, and she played such a key role in that. And then, of course, Ike's father, who I think is a little bit misunderstood, seen by some scholars as a martinet and maybe even abusive. I don't believe that at all, and that was never the way we thought of it in our family. As a matter of fact, he was a tough disciplinarian, but as you will see in the book How Ike Led, this inner discipline, was absolutely central to his capacity to do what he did later in his career. In any case, David Jacob Eisenhower gave Dwight Eisenhower, and by the way, Ida Stover did not like the nickname Ike at all. Once Mamie, as an aside, I should say, once Mamie wrote and said, Ike and I are out on a road trip, and Ida wrote back and said, I don't know who this Ike is you're talking about. Did you mean Dwight? So actually, I think in the context of Abilene, I should call him Dwight, though everybody knew him as Little Ike. It was Edgar who was Big Ike for some time. In any case, I should go back to David Jacob Eisenhower. It was his own struggle to find his independence within this community of German Americans who came in 1870 to Kansas that I think is rather moving. He wasn't sure he wanted to be a farmer at all, and he took up a small business that was helping farmers with not only the things to supply farmers with the things they needed for their agricultural goods, but that was not successful. And he ended up with some humility working at the creamery there in Abilene. I think Ike was very sensitive to the difficulties his father experienced. And I think what is interesting about these boys is that each of them had a different reaction to their father's difficulties. I think it inspired Edgar, who was, as you may remember, the brother just older than Ike. So Ike was number 3 out of 7 boys, 6 surviving boys. Arthur was the oldest, who actually left early on to go to Kansas. But Edgar was very prideful about things. He didn't like selling vegetables on the other side of the town, on the other side of the railroad tracks. And I think he was somewhat humiliated by David Jacob Eisenhower's financial difficulties, so much so that he determined that he was A, going to go to college, and B, was going to make a great financial success of himself. Dwight, of course, played a big role in putting his brother through college, but ended up going to a military academy, first at the suggestion of Sweet Hazlett, one of his pals there in Abilene, Kansas. First, he tried for the Naval Academy and was too old because he'd been looking after Edgar's interests at the University of Michigan, but later went to West Point because he wasn't too old, and just fate had it that the person who was actually selected for that post was unable to go to the military academy. So it was Dwight who went to West Point, and of course that was the moment that changed his life. In any case, the family dynamics are interesting. As modest an upbringing as they had, I personally was so moved to go to the reopening of the Carnegie Library there in Abilene a number of years ago. And they did a brilliant thing, I thought, in reopening the library after a renovation. They had a book of all the people who had been there when the library opened for the first time. And forgive me if I'm a year off or so, it was about 1907 or so. And David Jacob Eisenhower signed in, and then the book suggested that, the visitor that day write down the name of the book he or she was currently reading. I was charmed to see that David Jacob Eisenhower, as modest a worker as he was at the Abilene Creamery and, before that working on the railroad, had been reading a book called Uncle Sam's Secrets. And this was a book, it sounds like some kind of massive conspiracy theory, but no, it was a book about how the federal government was organized. And he was intensely interested in lofty subjects like that, despite the fact that he, was a modest worker. And I think that had a very big influence on Ike, in addition to the gentleness and centeredness that he got from his mother. In any case, Abilene appears many times in the book. One of my very, very favorite parts of this book was the fact that after World War II, and plus about 6.5 years when the Republicans and Democrats were actively trying to recruit Dwight Eisenhower as a candidate for president, and it started even during World War II. As early as 1943, the Republicans came calling because Franklin Roosevelt was going to run again, and they were desperate to beat him. I completely thought it was a crazy suggestion. He was in the middle of the war and wasn't about to, leave his important position there as commander of forces to run for president. But then after the war, and the Democrats came calling, then the Republicans, and then soon, it was Republicans and the Democrats, because nobody knew which party he came from. And in an absolutely unforgettable letter written by the county clerk of Abilene, Kansas, C.F. Moore, he wrote in response to the governor of New Hampshire, Sherman Adams, who wanted to know what Ike's political affiliation was. Was he a Democrat or Republican? Because it's a little hard finally to recruit somebody if nobody knew what political party he was associated with. And C.F. Moore wrote the most wonderful response to this, which you'll find in the book. And after a full paragraph about who knows what the son of David Jacob Eisenhower would do, in any voting situation, confirmed that David Jacob Eisenhower was a registered Republican, but said, you know, sons are doing a lot of things that are not like their fathers. In fact, some of the sons of America are spending this country into bankruptcy, and it is just a marvelous, marvelous return letter. In any case, he ends by saying, I don't think he has any politics. And I love that story because actually, you know, there's a real chance that Eisenhower didn't really have any party politics. He certainly was committed to eventually giving the Republican Party a chance to reinstate itself as a critical part of our democracy. As you know, when he ran for president, the Republicans had been out of power since the Great Depression. And Eisenhower believed in a vital two-party system so that we could advance the promise of the Constitution and to uphold the tenets of our democracy. In any case, let me just finally say that Swede Hazlitt, of course, represents Abilene at every turn in Eisenhower's story. What a remarkable friendship Dwight Eisenhower and Swede Hazlitt had. And despite the fact that Ike's international stature grew and grew throughout the years, he never forgot that Swede Hazlitt was his pal from Abilene High School and that they had always had something to say to each other. And Dwight Eisenhower used him as a sounding board, really, all the way up until Hazlitt's death in Eisenhower's second term. It's a very, very moving relationship. I also was amused in looking through the letters in the record, how many people in town in Abilene that I continue to correspond with, even while he was in the midst of his supreme command during World War II and also during the presidency. A list of ladies in town and others who wished him well, and they usually got a response. So let me just say one other thing. You know, I just really don't know how it happened that I ended up writing the bookends on the Eisenhower family. 25 years ago, quite literally, I wrote a book called Mrs. Ike, Memories and Reflections on the Life of Mamie Eisenhower. Despite the fact that I've been, you know, kind of a regular here in Washington in the foreign affairs field, I took that time out from extensive travel at that time to the Soviet Union and later New Russia to write this book because I learned something from the Russians, which is if you have something to say and you think you know something that other people don't know, you have an obligation to write it down because, you know, the people I knew in Russia were struggling and indeed celebrating literally everything that they didn't know about their past, for better or for worse. And I was moved by that and took a year and a half out of my life to write a book about my grandmother. Then surprise, surprise, coming into this time frame, I decided to write this book about my grandfather's leadership. Now, why did I write it? And I'm often asked that. Well, I wrote it because, first of all, we had this year, the 75th anniversary of victory in Europe. And then, of course, late August to September 1st, you know, the closing act on World War II. And then, of course, and I hope all of you know about it and are proud of the fact that we have a memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And that was dedicated on in September of this year. And then finally, we have this election that's underway now. Now, I'd say that the election was less important to me than those other events. But I really do think that Dwight Eisenhower presided over a period not dissimilar to the one we're in right now. In other words, it was a transformational time. We are in a transformational time, but caution here, my strong opinion is if anybody thinks that now is the most dangerous period of time we've ever lived in, they simply don't know anything about the past. Just think about Ike's own career. He played an important role. I mean, he was the commander of Camp Cold at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1917, 1918. And at the age of 27 or so, he commanded 10,000 men at Camp Colt, just literally right next to downtown Gettysburg. And in September of that year, two men came into the camp, and the Spanish influenza outbreak was there in real time, and an enormous responsibility for this young, fairly recently graduated Army officer from West Point. And Eisenhower's handling of the pandemic at Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and the innovative way he brought about the tank training under some very, very arduous circumstances won him a Distinguished Service Medal at the age of 28 years old. The Spanish influenza, as we know, was way more catastrophic than what we've got today. But I do think that today the international community is much more alert to what kind of measures had to be taken, because those numbers, if you do the math, could have been way out of control. In any case, the scale and the scope of World War II is something almost beyond human imagination. I teach a group of students at Gettysburg College, and during several years, I've taken them to Normandy, and I think that they have found it very difficult to get their brain around the number of forces that were deployed during that war in both fronts, and the catastrophe, really, that was World War II. There are all kinds of predictions about how many people perished, but I think the figure you see most often is 65 million people. So that is obviously infinitely more challenging, especially with the Depression leading into World War II, than what we have today. But nevertheless, today is a transformational time, and what made Eisenhower's transformation so difficult to manage, of course, was everything that went with World War II and the aftermath. I mean, Europe was ruined after the war, and millions of people, well upwards of 10 million people, were homeless. And not only was that a challenge, but bringing people home, trying to figure out force configurations, and then later trying to bring this country out of the Korean War that not only was unpopular, but in General Eisenhower's view, unwinnable. But the central part of the transformation, of course, was the element of the dawn of the nuclear era, not just atomic weapons, but the hydrogen bomb. I mean, still of such magnitude that you can't get your brain around that one. And we can talk about this later if you like, but it's absolutely extraordinary that today we're still capable of blowing up the world 5 times. And that's down from about 10 or 11 times at the height of the Cold War. Anyway, I'd like to just say that I'm fully compartmentalized. My family, I think my parents did a pretty good job of raising us kids. We were taught to keep separate what we knew and loved about Dwight Eisenhower from his policy. And so this book actually represents for me the first time I've really allowed myself to overlay what I know about Dwight Eisenhower as a person with the subjects that I've studied, as a Washington professional. Thanks to David Nichols, he did such a magnificent job on the story of Suez, et cetera. And I had General Goodpaster's memoirs and many others to look at. My own area of specialty, of course, was between relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I managed to bring to this some perspective. I actually knew many members of the Khrushchev family personally, some of whom I actually met in the Soviet Union before the collapse. And we always had a very interesting relationship because they were more apologetic about the behavior of their grandfather than I could have ever imagined. And so I tried to bring some of my own insights about things like that together with what I knew about Dwight Eisenhower. So let me just say something about what I think were his accomplishments and what I thought of him as a person. Obviously, he defeated Nazi power. This is no small thing. Now, it would also be fair that the Soviet Union played an enormous role on the Eastern Front. But still, had Eisenhower not been the supreme Allied commander as he was of the European theater, of the Western theater, many things could have been dramatically different, including Soviet Union's decision whether or not to abide by earlier agreements. Had we failed at D-Day, much of American history would have changed, and maybe the history of the world. I think one thing he doesn't get credit for, I'm going to put this under the list of accomplishments, is that he committed the United States on a bipartisan basis to a global leadership role. Let's remember that when he got elected in 1952 and was inaugurated in 53, actually, the Republicans were largely isolationists, at least the most powerful people in the Republican Party. And somehow, for those 8 years, Eisenhower reshaped the Republican Party to be an internationalist party. And it was not easy, I can tell you, since the Democrats were already committed to Marshall plans and other things that had come about after the war. This really cemented for the United States a bipartisan approach to our international responsibilities. And through the Solarium Project and others I outline in my book, Eisenhower brought all of the warring parties together in the executive bureaucracy to assure that we were all working off the same page during his administration. So this was no, cultural change is extraordinarily hard. So that was, I think, one accomplishment that has not been properly analyzed. And then, of course, we all always say at 8 years of peace and prosperity, he balanced the budget 3 times and came close on another 2, leaving a surplus for his successor. Now, all that sounds very easy, but think of what he did in the meantime. He also built an interstate highway system, had a huge infrastructure build out, and reshaped America for the modern era, including creating an FAA, an aviation administration that could sort out the skies. He was the first president of the space age, so he created the framework for free access to space. It goes on and on like that. He also, while being a fiscal conservative, managed to expand the social safety net, making it sure that people who, through no fault of their own, who were disabled or unable to work for medical reasons actually were covered. This was a lesson left from the tragedy of the Great Depression, and no small matter to end the Korean War. And after that moment, no combat casualties of US forces for the subsequent 7 years, which is just extraordinary, I think. In any case, let's not misrepresent perhaps what might have most resonance today. In the course of all this, during a very dangerous time in the Cold War, he united a fractious and frightened America. During a period of technological dislocation, a turbulent social and technological time, and in a period of vast change as many countries around the world broke out of their colonial traditions and gained their own sovereignty. So I think the reason I wrote that book, and one author once said to me, why do people write books? Well, they write books because, he reminded me, they have something they have to say. So this is what I had to say. I had to say, I don't know how he did all this and kept his balance, kept his calm, and never became hard or cynical. When I think of the horrendous responsibility he had, I mean, literally in sending people to, well, let's put it another way, including deploying people whose fates were not clear, some of whom lived and some of whom died. The fact that he was accountable for that, the fact that he was humble, I don't know how he did that given what he saw and what he had to process for himself. But all I can say is that I believe that he lived with a commitment to something larger than himself. I think he got that from his parents in Abilene, Kansas. I think he got that from a community like the one you live in. And I believe that West Point cemented this in his mind. He, as a cadet at West Point, committed himself to defending the Constitution. And he did that for his entire professional life, not just when he became president. He believed that unity of purpose was critical for the Allied cause, just as it was to bring America together and to support its Constitution. And so let me end by saying, I think the thing that makes me feel most emotional about this book and everything else is that I can assure you that he died as he lived. He's buried right there in your community. I'm so terribly sorry on his 130th birthday, as this is, that I'm not able to be there to pay my respects to him. He was a remarkable man. He's a product of Abilene, Kansas. He's the product of a great family. He's the product of West Point. He's the product of a man who understood his place in the great scheme of things. And I hope that you share with me a sense of pride that he came from the American heartland, and that people have come to recognize that at the end of the day, he too should be honored on the Mall in Washington, D.C. So thank you for this opportunity. Dawn, I hand it back to you. I'm all ready for questions or anything else.
Sure. Do you want to go through the photos with Samantha?
Sure, that'd be fun.
All right, let's do that first. Samantha, you ready to show some photos? We pulled together some photos from the archives, and then Susan can talk about them.
Okay, well, this will be fun. Only cute pictures, please. Oh, this is one of my favorites. Don't you just love this picture? So, his aides, and I knew them all. It was, or at least all the ones who were living when I came to Washington, D.C., and they all wanted to know me too, which floored me. I couldn't imagine why all these distinguished people wanted to know a 27 or 28-year-old woman, but I think I was so interested, and they wanted to tell me what this guy was like. But look at this smile. They used to tell me that he could fill an empty room. I mean, his energy, his personality, and this extraordinary smile. So thank you for using that photo. I think it's one of the best. Don't you agree, Dawn?
Yes, indeed. I love that smile.
Yeah. Well, he could use that smile to great effect. I think it was in Abilene, he learned that if you got punched in the nose and you fell down, that the way to respond was to get up and flash a smile. And, not only was it a fact, but it also turned out to be a great metaphor for all the other times that he used that optimism, that outward optimism, to cover maybe some of the things that worried him most. Okay.
What's next?
Well, okay, here we are, and we see that Ike is here with his younger brothers, and this is David Jacob, who I mentioned, and Ida. Ike's the tall one in the middle, and I think that's probably Earl to his right, and Milton to his left. However, Milton is sometimes pictured with slightly longer hair, which is kind of fun. But I knew Milton Eisenhower very well. He influenced me a lot. And he took a special interest in me. He loved people my age. He was a university president. And he once told me how he loved Ike of all of his brothers in a way that he, more than the other. Because Ike had a kind of empathy. And Milton told me once, he says, do you know what the greatest thing your grandfather ever did for me? Is that he told me, hey, Milton, you don't have to be, a big athlete or anything. It's so important that you're an intellectual. Mm-hmm. And Milton thought that this kind of permission from his big bro, was the kindest thing that happened to him, because he really clearly was not keeping up with his older, more swashbuckling brothers. Yeah, there's Ike. I think, well, I can tell you this. I found in Mrs. Ike, in family correspondence, the actual date that Ike starts losing his hair. That's about 1928. 28. Apparently, Ike used to look in the mirror all the time and, wonder what he was going to do without a full head of hair. So this has got to be sometime after 28. And Dawn, maybe you know when he came back to Abilene for that visit. But
Samantha, do you have the metadata?
That one is 1938.
It's 38.
Mhm.
Okay, because it's 28, so he's already, been losing hair for 10 years. So no, that's kind of a joke, but Ida Stover was remarkable because she had all of these sons, and they all had very different personalities, different political views, etc. But she always, when once asked, "Aren't you proud of your son?" This is after the war. She replied, "Which one?" Wow, what a great mom that is. That's another, look at that smile, another great picture. Okay, well, what I'd add here is that I was interested to find in my research that Ike never wore a helmet, even when he was in harm's way, unless he was ordered to by one of his subordinates because he was way too close to the front. But Ike's valet, Mickey McKeough, was fast to say that often their lives were in danger, and if nobody was telling the general, the Supreme Allied Commander, what to do, he would not wear a helmet because he felt that it was presumptuous, that it would give the signal that he thought he was like one of the people who are regularly in harm's way. And sometimes before there were squads actually out to assassinate him towards the end of the war, he would drive around in a Jeep like this and sometimes pick up GIs on the road, to kind of question them and find out how they were doing. By the way, I should add that during the war, Eisenhower was very insistent that good food was central to morale. And so that, and I would add probably that great smile went a long way toward cementing his relationship with the GIs. Well, there's a serious looking guy. Wow, let's see how many stars does he have on his shoulder at that point. It looks like maybe his 5-star cluster. But it's a great picture. Great picture because you see the Ike at ease and the Ike who means business. I'd say that's the I mean business picture. Well, this is a nice picture. This is, I believe, well, it's certainly taken in North Africa. I think it may be Algiers, though I could be wrong. It might be Tunisia. But you can see a picture of Mamie there and the various Allied flags. Ike wrote Mamie, I think there were 356 handwritten letters during the war. Mamie is pretty insistent that if he was going to type up a letter, she really wasn't so crazy about receiving it because she would be assuming that, it would be a time shortening thing. So, send me handwritten letters when you can do it. But often what happened is, of course, they crossed in the mail. And so they were both writing each other. We have a wonderful book my father edited called Letters to Mamie. If you get a chance to see it, it's a great edition. The famous picture of Eisenhower in the 101st Airborne Division before they deploy. Well, they're deploying that evening to go to Normandy to an uncertain fate. I think the thing that's so moving about this picture is that one of the toughest parts of the D-Day decision was Eisenhower's conviction that these airborne troops had to be used, despite the fact that his airborne commander, Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, predicted that there would be losses between 50 and 70%. Ike decided that the airborne troops had to be used anyway because they were crucial. They were, frankly, the linchpin of the Normandy assault. And, if they hadn't been successful, we would not have been able to get our troops off of parts of Omaha and Utah Beach. So having decided that he'd have to take that risk, feeling actually in his gut that probably the predictions were too extreme, he nevertheless went out and looked these young men directly in the eyes. Just a quick word on this one. Notice the hand gesture, please. The hand gesture actually indicates that General Eisenhower is telling number 23 about his experience with fly fishing. So you can see he's about to cast his line there. That's what the thumb is all about. It's not a dissertation on going to whip Hitler. It's an attempt on Eisenhower's part to connect with the GI, and secondly to remind them of home and what they have to live for. Number 23 survived the war and came back to tell us exactly what that conversation was about, and weren't we fortunate to have that information.
And we're honored to have that uniform in our museum.
Well, that's fantastic. And you remember Eisenhower wrote that note. I know it's one of the treasures of the Eisenhower Library, where he takes full and complete blame should the operation fail. But, you know, he's looking at the guys there who had a very, very tough job to do, especially with the dicey weather forecast. Oh, now here we're bringing out the cute ones, right? The kids, right? Just a little joke there. So, okay. So Mary, who is a resident of Abilene, Kansas now, is the cutie pie holding Mamie's hand. And David, I don't know what the bow tie deal is, but he wore a bow tie a lot in those days. My sister Ann is in between my father, our father, John, and granddad. And I'm the one with the little, I think I have ponytail there, but the darker dress. You know, this is a little unusual because my mother or somebody got the crazy idea to dress us in 3 different sizes of the same dress. And there are lots of kind of 1950s style pictures of that. But in any case, this is taken on the first floor of the White House. Well, here we go. We've got John Foster Dulles and Winston Churchill, and it looks like Anthony Eden there. And well, we've got David Nichols here with us tonight. I'm not exactly sure when this visit took place, but you know, you can tell that they're comrades in arms left from the war, but you know, the adventure was about to start, right?
Yeah, I can't help with that very precisely. That's not my area of expertise.
Yeah, well, I think Churchill came obviously well before Suez, so that's an extremely reasonable guess. But Churchill came again in 1959. I actually had an opportunity to meet him at that time. He had already had a stroke, and you know, he was treated with great respect. Ike admired him so much. I had the audacity to paint a picture for him of myself and my horse, which is completely ludicrous because Winston Churchill actually was a pretty good painter. I mean, really a good painter. Ike sort of emulated Churchill's hobby there, but was less certain that his paintings would last as anything other than simple daubs that he used to center himself and to relax while he was thinking through ideas.
Susan, that photo is 1954.
Okay.
Are you going to mention something about the bench in the background?
The bench in the background. Well, actually, you know, when First Lady Melania Trump, I don't know what it would be called, maybe refashion the Rose Garden. I was worried for the second time in my life that Pete the parakeet was going to be dug up from the ground back there, because just behind there, my grandparents allowed us to give Pete the parakeet a dignified funeral. Pete had lived on the 3rd floor of the White House and died somewhere probably in the late mid 50s. And I remember a very ceremonial moment. We had a little headstone for Pete, but no doubt that went the way of anything else that was in the middle of the lawn while the lawnmowers were out. But Every time I look at the Rose Garden, I think about that ceremony and how the White House is not only an official place, but it's a family gathering. It's a home and it's a family gathering spot too. And we were lucky enough to spend enough time there to understand that kind of special role that it plays. Okay, now there's the Eisenhower look again. This is a different kind of look. This is a run through that for me again look. This is John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, who, by the way, had, I would say, differing views for sure than Eisenhower on a number of things. But Eisenhower really appreciated Foster Dulles's feedback and ideas. As a matter of fact, for all of the people who say that Ike had probably a very difficult time during the war managing all these big personalities and you know, trying to compose their differences, he actually sets up the White House in a very similar way. Has a chief of staff in Governor Sherman Adams, who's very much like General Walter Beadle Smith, you know, gruff, no nonsense types. And again, during the White House years, Ike surrounds himself with people of divergent viewpoints, much as he had that experience during the war. So I think Ike didn't like yes men. That's all it came down to that. Did not like yes men. He wanted the unvarnished truth. And there we are. I think that's Arbor Day, if I recall the the caption for that one. That's me. So we didn't do that many official things in the White House, but we were occasionally brought to ceremonies like this. I may have this slightly wrong, but I think there was an occasion when my brother attended a press conference and somebody called, we were calling our own grandfather Ike at that point. And when somebody referred to President Eisenhower, David apparently piped up and says, that's not his name. His name is Ike. Oh my gosh. Did we have a big family council about that? And we were all told after that, we're calling him Granddad, no more Ike. Okay. Oh, there I am. That's one of my, wow, I haven't seen that picture in a really long time. Well, this was a Shetland pony named Me Too. And Me Too and I won a number of little ribbons, as you can see there. And I think the first one I won was a walk trot competition. And what's so really endearing about all of that is that the trophy was about about 2 inches by 2 inches, a tiny little cup. And it disappeared one day. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, Granddad presented it to me. It was all wrapped up and everything. And it turned out that he had that little cup mounted on a pedestal. So to say that I got a lot of encouragement in my riding experience would be correct. This is Ike and Mamie at the farm in Gettysburg. They had a very extensive garden there. You can see them standing in it. Later, that had to be taken out, but it wasn't before a number of world leaders came to the farm and were also pictured in approximately the same spot. I used to think of the Eisenhower farm as kind of what I'd call the inner Camp David. If negotiations weren't successful, or if he really wanted to meet with his wartime colleagues and have an informal time, they came to the farm. So there we have Ike and Mamie probably not long after the garden was planted. Oh, well, let's see, who have we got here? Oh, it looks like Winston Churchill in a golf cart. Yes, he came to the farm, was subjected to the usual farm tour. Ike was so excited about his Black Angus cows, and so it didn't matter who you were, you had to go out and be given the full treatment. As a matter of fact, when Nikita Khrushchev came to the farm in 1959, after while they were trying to negotiate the end of the Berlin ultimatum, Khrushchev expressed an interest in Ike's Black Angus cows and received one as a gift on the spot from the President of the United States. Oh, here we are again. So, wow. I don't know. I'm not sure where that is, but I have a kind of funny feeling that this is Puerto Rico. We went to Puerto Rico for a brief visit, and I think that's probably when it was. But it's fun to see that. And don't you love the little white socks and the formality of all of us dressed up as kids? And there we are. Copy of the book. Now, I'd just say one final thing about this, and I'd love some questions, but my editor wanted me very much to call it How Ike Led, the Principles Behind Eisenhower's Greatest Decisions. And I said, you know what, why don't we leave that up to the reader? But I do hope that the book has added, some of the human dimension of Ike's leadership, because I think, as I'd say in wrapping this up before questions, character matters. And I tried to show that he led with empathy and humility and accountability. And these are critical principles, no matter what era we're living in.
So Susan, we actually do have a few questions queued up in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and read them for you, okay?
Please.
We have a question from Linda saying, what surprised you the most in your research?
Well, first of all, I was really surprised to put together, I wasn't surprised, but there's so many wonderful stories from ordinary Americans. As a matter of fact, when the copy editing on my book was done, the copy editor proofreader wrote me back where I said something about how he loved kids and did things for kids. And she wrote back and she said, I grew up in New York City and my teacher said, let's go to Columbia University and meet the president of Columbia. So she's writing this to me and she says they got to Low Library and I don't know, her teacher sent a note upstairs and told the president of the university, Dwight Eisenhower, that there were a group of students down on the first floor of Low Library, and he actually came down and met the kids. Stuff like that. So I continue to hear from people all the time about really endearing things he did for people who couldn't vote for him, couldn't do anything. I think, though, at the end of the day, the most important thing that stays with me is I simply can't imagine how he processed everything he saw in his career and managed to be a normal person at home. And in every case, never came up with a cynical answer for anything, that he just never became hard. And I'm just so struck by it because I'm not sure that many people could have gone through all that. I think we have to put this down to his upbringing, but also a belief in something bigger than himself.
That's a good point. Well, Greg asks, what are your favorite books about Eisenhower that were not authored by a member of your family?
Well, we have been on this subject, haven't we? But, every time we think somebody misunderstands something, then there's this impulse. It's back to telling what we know, I guess, that is very compelling. In my book, of course, I said it before, I love David Nichols' books, which were so informative and important. But, I really loved Bill Ewald's book, Eisenhower the President, just because it's so colorful and it's kind of it's an insider's view. I think some things he misinterpreted slightly, only because I was the beneficiary of hearing Granddad talk about things at the dining room table. One of the big principles at the dining room table when I was a kid is you never corner anybody, okay? That was one of the recurring themes. And so I don't know how well Ewald captures that part, but it's a very colorful book and I like it. But one of my absolute favorites was Mickey McKeogh's book, General Ike and Sergeant Mickey. And I can tell you, Ike was not pleased that his own valet was writing a book about their time together during the war, because I'm sure that all these little intimate stories about Ike, probably made the general a little bit uncomfortable. But it's such a loving book, but it's hysterical. It's really funny. We find out that Ike had to borrow Winston Churchill's pajamas one night because Mickey forgot to pack them, and they end up, riding all the way up in the middle of the night, and Ike thinking that he's being strangled and wakes up screaming. I mean, you know, stuff like this. I didn't manage to make that into the book because there wasn't a theme behind it, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And I hope everybody has a chance to read it. Somebody had the great good sense to get it back into print.
Thank you. Danielle asks, the entire Eisenhower family was successful. What lessons did David, Jacob, and Ida impart to their boys that caused them to all be motivated to do so well?
Well, I would say that they were a very successful lot, but I think, first of all, we have to be clear about this, is that timing and luck play some roles, but actually timing and luck can come along and you can also blow it. So I think that these boys were exceedingly lucky to have a father that imparted in them a strong sense of discipline, and a mother who was all about fairness and cooperation and looking at things through other people's perspective, all of those values. And those parents worked as a team. But the discipline's a very big part of it. We live in a rather undisciplined time, and I think we underestimate the value of being able to sort out your own internal landscape before you, visit every inner thought on everybody else. So I think it was a remarkable combination of those two.
Thank you. Greg says, did the incident during the 1952 campaign impact his relationship with George Marshall?
The scholarship on that says no. Eisenhower had already defended George Marshall on numerous occasions. I don't know, either 4 or 5 occasions. And actually, that situation in Wisconsin was a mistake, to be sure, but not one that he thought he was on the record already with respect to the important remarks he made about Marshall's patriotism and his indispensable role as not only a patriot, but a great general. According to my father's book, Strictly Personal, there is a whole appendix in there from Frank McCarthy, who worked for General Marshall, about how close their relationship was during Eisenhower's White House years. So that would be by definition after the Wisconsin event.
Greg also asks, can you talk about Eisenhower's role in the integration of the armed services?
Yeah, well, I think that's an important role. And again, we've got the real national and international expert on this, Dave Nichols, who's with us. But from everything I've read, he really took up that Truman executive order and made it real. And actually, if you think about it, it probably helped a lot that Eisenhower had been a general before and understood how Army bases worked. As a matter of fact, from what I understand, DOD schools were desegregated before Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, when he put his mind to something, he was very diligent. He did not tend to suffer too much from what I'd call two-mindedness. I think that's largely because he waited until he was convinced that he knew what he wanted to do on a subject. And of course, this delay while he's thinking through the complexity of an issue annoyed, some of his detractors because they thought he was moving too slowly on a range of issues. But I'm sure it was not an easy thing. But the military, he was in an ideal position to execute on that.
Thank you. So that's the last of the questions that's queued up. Does anybody want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Or you can put some more?
Hey, Susan, this is Matt Beasley. Is that painting behind you a Grandma Moses painting?
Well, Mac, how nice to hear your voice. Well, wouldn't it be nice if it were? Because maybe I might reconsider retirement. Actually, this painting behind me, my grandparents gave me. And it's just a wonderful primitive of Pennsylvania Dutch country. I don't know how many people on this program know too much about the Eisenhower family's origins, but they weren't Amish. But the Eisenhowers were, as you know, Mac, probably a subset of the Mennonite faith and part of the River Brethren as they lived in Elizabethville, Pennsylvania, and then eventually moved to Abilene, Kansas. But there, is certainly in the 1950s, there was a great vibe of the Amish and Mennonite communities that still lived in the area. And today in Gettysburg, you'll still see Brethren churches, but very little of the kind of color we see behind us here in this painting. I'm not sure who the painter is, but why don't I just tell everybody it's a Grandma Moses? I think it's a great idea.
It looks like one that's in the museum collection. That's why I said.
Oh, is that right? Well, I don't know. I'm going to have to, all right.
At least the similar style for sure.
Yeah, well, I think he liked the kind of primitive, because there was also one hanging on the porch in Gettysburg, you may remember. But he also loved color, and this is very bold in its colors. I've got a couple of other paintings in this apartment that he did. As a matter of fact, if I could just take an opportunity to talk about one that was painted in 1957. And I know the library, I quoted your colleague there at the library about Ike and his painting. And, it really is true that his landscapes, he always chose very serene landscapes. But the one I've got, and I'm looking at it, it's on the other side here, wasn't large enough to put over my couch, unfortunately. But painted in 1957, and then on the back it says for Susan 1958. So you can imagine that it was painted between the fall of 57 to when he gave it to me in 58, which puts him squarely in the Little Rock Sputnik period. And the observation that his paintings were always so placid and tranquil. Again, he used this painting as a way to center himself. He also painted a lot of portraits of people, including Queen Elizabeth's 2 children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, and also his wartime colleagues, as you know. But he paid attention to stuff like that, which is really interesting. I mean, like the painting behind me.
Do we have any other questions on the line? Susan, I actually have something while we're waiting. When I read your book, one of the things that really jumped out at me was when you talked about how Eisenhower was playing a long game in the administration, and he wasn't necessarily trying to do what needed to be done for the next 4 years or however long he was in office, but really positioning America to be a world power in a new age. That was really sort of transformative to me, and I'd like to see if you had anything else to share with me on that.
I think it is so important, Dawn. Thank you so much for raising that. It is so important as a philosophical approach to what he was doing. He took a lot of big hits in his second term, especially, and I think Sputnik, according to a number of historians, was really the moment when everybody realized, this popular president is at last vulnerable. Because now we're going to be able to attack him around something, because he really was that popular for a very long time and retained his popularity for sure, but still was vulnerable over the attacks that were made on subjects he couldn't talk about because of the classified nature of them. And Sputnik was one of them. It's very clear that the United States could have launched an artificial satellite a year before the Soviet Union, but that wasn't the object of the exercise. This was part of International Geophysical Year, a program sponsored by the International Scientific Union for the launching of artificial satellites by the United States and the Soviet Union. We knew they were going to do it. It was on the front page of the New York Times a couple of days before the actual Soviet launch. But Eisenhower was not unhappy that the Soviets went first because they accidentally validated a principle that had not been established. That was freedom of outer space. Remember that the Soviet Union refused overflights of their own territory with the Open Skies proposal. And so it wasn't at all clear that any satellite going into space would be acceptable to the Soviet Union once they realized that they were establishing free access to low Earth orbit and beyond. Now, why does that matter? Because Eisenhower desperately wanted to put up reconnaissance satellites instead of overflying the Soviet Union, because reconnaissance satellites would be able to keep track of Soviet military developments, including averting the potential of a surprise nuclear attack. That's a good example because he got beaten up around the ears. And I think that was really a flat out case of political exploitation, because according to everything I read, the public was not immediately in a state of panic. But by the time his opposition realized the significance of this event, they played it for all it was worth, followed not long after by the missile gap, which seemed to suggest that the Eisenhower administration had let the side down on our own defense capabilities. So it took a lot of courage, actually, to stand up and take the heat.
All right, we got a question posted from Ray. Ray says, during D-Day and before June 6th, the British general in charge of the paratroopers predicted very high casualties. General Eisenhower had to make the decision for those paratroopers as to where would they drop, in a safer area or a more dangerous area. Do you know much about this decision?
Well, I alluded to it earlier in my comments when we were looking at the picture of Eisenhower in the 101st Airborne Division. I think he described it as a soul-racking decision. And there are a couple of things about it which I think are really noteworthy. When Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory came to General Eisenhower and said that he now recommended against not dropping the airborne troops because the Germans had moved some new forces into the area, and he felt quite certain those troops were going to be annihilated. Eisenhower, the first thing Eisenhower does is to say, okay, put your recommendation to me in writing, because he says, if I decide against you and you're right and the mission fails, I don't want you to be held responsible for the fiasco. Now, I don't know how you feel about it, but this is absolutely stunning, really, when you think about it. A Supreme Allied commander caring so much about his technical, his commander of airborne forces, that he wanted to protect that man, and actually writes him a note. It's in my book. He writes him and he says, thank you very much for raising your concerns with me. Something to the effect that you are absolutely correct to do so. And then he goes on to say, I've decided not to take your advice and to deploy those troops. But still, the fact that he protected his airborne commander in case of that, it turns out, rather than 50 to 70% losses, the losses were more around 4% that day and as high as 10 by the end of the operation. So a very different configuration, still very, very high. But I personally believe that if you take that airborne decision plus the perilous weather forecast, but parentheses, even the committee of meteorologists did not agree on the weather forecast. That's how tricky it was. Think about how much tougher the weather forecast is if you know you have this protection or this prediction of cataclysm with the airborne troops, when airborne troops of all troops need to have the right weather conditions in order to drop on their targets. So I think that there was way more to the decision-making going into D-Day than we tend to account for. And, it was a very, very fine moment of moral courage.
All right. Any other questions?
Susan, Dave, Nichols here. I just think it's a great book, and that Don, I was struck by that long game quote too. I'm including in an article I'm working on at the moment. It's Susan's recommendation that I write the article, and it not only was it in foreign affairs, but one of the examples I use is the interstate highway system, which is really the long game. I mean, nothing has profoundly affected American life more than the interstate highway system, and that was Ike's baby.
Yeah, David, thank you for that. And may I also add, in the long game, and especially as you're making an important point about the interstate highway system, imagine the other things that we completely take for granted because we don't even realize it. Bringing in Hawaii and Alaska, I mean, that is a big transformational moment. But I think Antarctica stands out for me as a really remarkable thing. You know, we've got all kinds of tensions rising right now in the Arctic. Antarctica in the 1950s was a similar kind of uncomfortable situation where there were claimants to that continent. At the same time, with the rise of nuclear weapons, it was imagined that nuclear weapons could be placed there as staging grounds or a place to dump nuclear material or all kinds of other things. And just literally right after Sputnik, Eisenhower convenes quietly, to be sure, a group to work out putting Antarctica away in perpetuity for scientific and peaceful uses only, and stuck his neck out by making sure that the Soviet Union were part of those negotiations so that they couldn't be the spoilers in the end. Again, I mean, very far-sighted because it was potentially a flashpoint in the Cold War, at least at some stage, if not right away.
Okay, so I just want you to know that Ray mentioned thank you, that he didn't know Lee Mallory put his concerns in writing. And he writes, Eisenhower was a quality person, thank you.
Well, it's very nice of you to say, Ray, if I may call you that. I think you'll see other examples of that. Now, I should say very quickly, you know, that Dwight Eisenhower wasn't a perfect person. He had his foibles. But, you know, in knowing the members of the family and everything, we saw very little that one could. He was, as his West Point yearbook said, as big as life and twice as natural. And the great thing about him from a personality point of view, and I always admired this and thought everybody in the world was like this, and of course, very few are, what you saw was what you got. I mean, he was very direct. Sometimes his temper would flare, but it was like a passing thunderstorm, you know. He just, I'm not going to say he was uncomplicated, but he was a very, very straightforward person. And I always admired that, a transparent, straightforward person. And so thank you for that nice comment.
So Shannon says thank you. She can't wait to read her book. And her parents thought Ike was an awesome man and a great president. And she remembers when he was reelected and watching it on her black and white TV.
On her black and white TV. Oh my gosh. And they were big TVs too, right?
And Verlene has a question. Verlene says, can you expand upon earlier remarks about Ike and the Panama Canal? Is there someone else whose expertise is the Panama Canal? I may have misunderstood, and you could have fleetingly mentioned the Suez Canal. I only mention this because our daughter was able to do some translation from the French for you and for the library.
Well, I think I may have mentioned the Suez Canal, but the Panama Canal, you're completely correct about that. I spent the early 20s in the Panama Canal, and it was an extraordinarily important moment for him because during those years he was there with General Fox Connor, who'd been chief of operations for John Pershing during World War I. I think Fox Connor was not very well known to outsiders, but he was a very well-respected, serious man. And today he's probably remembered for as much for the people he mentored as for his wartime contribution during the First War, that is. Ike was recruited to go down there by General Connor and spent a lot of time with the general talking about military strategy and the coming war, because even in the 20s, both Fox Connor and then his protege, Dwight Eisenhower, were pretty sure another war was coming. And they used, or certainly Eisenhower used that time to prepare himself for, the coming events, that unfolded for the United States on Pearl Harbor and afterwards.
So we are running a bit over, but I love having a great conversation. But I'm going to take the last question from Klaus Pika. And Klaus says, could you tell us another personal story? This is what museum visitors love so much.
Another personal story?
Yes.
Do you know the thing? Well, there are a couple. I mentioned a couple of them in the book, but, I said I was fully compartmentalized, but occasionally Ike's position, would come into sharp relief. Now, look, there were no secret about the fact that we weren't a normal family. Okay. I mean, I had Secret Service protection for 8 years, and all my siblings had Secret Service protection. And I could tell you of the things I'm probably mostly proud of. One of the Secret Servicemen named his only child Susie. So I have, phew. Well, the whole Secret Service thing, now that's a story all by itself. But, I think, and it's in the book about how, my riding career had its ups and downs. The horses I was responsible for one evening trampled Granddad's golf green that he had installed so that he could enjoy the privacy of his own little putting green to practice his putts. I will leave the punchline of that story for you when you get to the book. But I was starting to tell you about how the gravity of everything he dealt with. I had a couple of exchanges with him about policy things, and occasionally, I recount one occasion when my middle school teacher wanted me to ask him why he didn't intervene in the Hungarian uprising. And my grandfather was so irritated by that comment because he didn't like people using his grandchildren to get to him that he sort of barked at me. He said, "What, and start World War III?" I thought, wow, did I misscope that one? But I think largely he was so good at leaving what worried him in the office and really being there and present in the evenings. My grandmother insisted on it. She really did. And I think that we were really the beneficiaries of that because for us it seemed all very normal. Now, where it got kind of fun in retrospect is that he had this group of people around him who were his friends. And as I say in the book, he didn't like to mix business and pleasure. So he had a couple of partners on the farm in Gettysburg, and they came to visit. And then others like George Allen, who he and his wife, Mary Allen, were friends from Washington. They'd known each other since the war, but they bought a place just down the road. And occasionally we'd overhear things like, the moment when one of these businessmen said, well, when are we going to see some tax relief? And I remember sitting there on the porch hearing him bark, and how do you think we're going to pay for things? Wow. Lots of card playing, lots of seriousness around that. But there are some very personal moments. I do remember my grandmother talking to people who would call after Granddad passed, and all these wonderful people who did that, and the way the Secret Service gathered around her, and the way, the doorman and the maids from the White House came up to visit her in her widowhood. I mean, these are all things we sort of took for granted, but it made me realize that that this couple was more than just Granddad and Grandmother. And I will say, if maybe I could just leave our evening on this, and I don't mean to be too emotional about this, but it's a very odd thing to grow up with somebody of this power. He had huge personality power, but also power in the very real sense of the word over decisions, that affected real people's lives. And I was always struck by how kind he was, including a story you'll read in the book about how he wanted to help celebrate my African-American English teacher's birthday because they both had the same name, Ike. You know, just such kindnesses. But then you understood that, you know, that there was this power. And I don't think I'll ever forget the time he was in the hospital and the people who offered their own hearts so that he wouldn't die. I mean, you can't get your head around what this man meant. So that when the memorial was finally dedicated, I think all my family members, so they wouldn't say it directly, but I'll speak only for myself. How's that? I've had a hard time understanding that with that memorial, this man does not belong to my family anymore. And then I've had to cope with the fact that probably he never did. He probably never belonged just to us. And I don't think people can understand what that's really like, not to really own anything, including your childhood, you know. So there's nothing sad about it. It's just very different. And I think we were actually raised as normal kids. My father kept saying, with a kind of pointed finger, don't you think you're going to start wearing your grandfather's stars? Okay. Thank you, Dad, because it's stood us in good stead all these years. But we do now realize that he's passed into history. That's what the whole process of memorialization is. He's passed into history. And what is so thrilling about it is that he is welcomed not only internationally, but also at home as a true American hero. And for that, we are willing to give him up.
Oh, Susan, how beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. I am incredibly grateful that you offered to do this with us. Incredibly grateful.
Well, you know, it's always a treat, and I want everybody to know that what a great institution you have there in Abilene, Kansas. I mean, everyone does a devoted, terrific job, and the foundation, Marilyn Schlichter, and all she does to support the library and the museum. I just can't tell you how meaningful it is to have Ike there with you in Abilene.
We feel it every day, Susan. We really do. The whole town does.
Yeah.
Well, we have a couple of announcements before we say goodbye. There's a bunch of people in the chat saying thank you, Susan, but Samantha's going to put up some slides so I give you guys the right dates for our future events. First of all, I need to thank the Eisenhower Foundation. It is through the Eisenhower Foundation that we are able to provide educational programming such as this. And this year, the Eisenhower Foundation secured sponsorship from the Union Pacific Foundation. So thank you to both of those organizations. Our next Lunch and Learn will be Thursday, October 22nd. We have Corrine Porter. She's the curator of our National Archives building on Pennsylvania Avenue. She's going to be talking to us about the Rightfully Hers exhibit in Washington, D.C. I'm really looking forward to that. And our next Ike Book Talk will be To Hell and Back. The movie is available for streaming if you want to stream that as well. And Jeff, who is on the line, Jeff is going to lead us in our discussion on the book To Hell and Back. So join us for that Tuesday, November 10th at 7 p.m. All of the links can be found on our website or our Facebook page. So that concludes my announcements. And so thank you, Susan. And you guys have a great night. I'll see you next time.